Welcome back to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul between. I'm Kimberly, an intuitive grief guide, death doula, licensed esthetician, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. If you're listening to this podcast, it's likely because you've crossed or you're standing inside a threshold. And thresholds are rarely loud. They're often subtle, disorienting, hard to name, not a beginning, not an ending, and just something you can feel approaching. Today's episode is about those moments when life changes and you realize you are not who you were before, but you're not yet who you're becoming. Sometimes it's a birthday that arrives and leaves you unsettled, an anniversary you didn't think would hit this hard, a season change that brings a heaviness you can't explain, or a question someone asks casually that lands like a bruise. Nothing happens, and yet something shifts. Your energy changes, your patience thins, your body tightens or goes quiet. Your nervous system moves into alert or retreat, and you might find yourself thinking, why now? Why this moment? I thought I was past this. But thresholds don't follow timelines, they follow meaning. So if today feels heavier than it should, if you're bracing without knowing why, if you feel caught between who you were and who you're becoming, you're in the right place. Let's talk about what thresholds actually are and why your body knows before your mind does. A threshold is not the event itself. It's not the breakup, it's not the diagnosis, it's not the loss. It's not the move, not the ending. Threshold is the space after, when something has shifted internally and the old way of being no longer fits. It's the moment when you go back to your life, but it feels unfamiliar. When people expect you to be the same and you aren't. Your body reacts before your mind catches up and you feel suspended between versions of yourself. And our culture doesn't know how to hold the in-between. Knows how to celebrate beginnings, how to announce endings, but the middle, the messy becoming, that part often gets rushed or ignored. One of the hardest things about thresholds is that they don't come with language. You don't always know what you're grieving yet. Something just feels off. People often think grief shows up as sadness, but thresholds often show up as confusion. You might think, why am I reacting like this? Why does this feel harder than it should? It's because the body senses change before the mind can organize it. Your nervous system feels the shift first. I want to talk about thresholds a little differently here, not as vague life transitions, but as something that happens very specifically inside of named grief. Because when people hear the word threshold, they sometimes think of something abstract, a phase, a season, a mindset. But thresholds show up very clearly after real loss. When someone dies, when a relationship ends in a way that fractures your sense of safety, when life splits into before and after, even if the outside world keeps moving as if nothing happened. That's when the thresholds begin. Not at the moment of loss, but after, when you realize you're standing in a life that no longer fits the person you used to be. The loss itself is the event, but the threshold is everything that comes after. It's the moment you ask questions no one prepared you for. If you lose a child, there can be a moment where you wonder, am I still a parent? Not because your love disappeared, but because the world no longer mirrors that identity back to you. If you lose a parent, it can be a moment where you ask, am I still a daughter? Am I still a son? Because the role you held, the one that oriented your place in the family, in the lineage, has shifted. And no one really talks about that part. People talk about missing them, about sadness, about anniversaries, but they don't talk about what it feels like when your identity suddenly has no place to land. That is a threshold. Thresholds in named grief often show up around moments when life expects you to resume. Holidays, birthdays, milestones, family gatherings, new relationships, and suddenly you're not just grieving the person you lost, you're navigating how to exist in a world that doesn't know where to place you anymore. That is not something you get over, that's something you cross. Because dates aren't just points on a calendar, they carry memory, expectation, meaning, and when you've experienced loss, dates don't arrive quietly. Your body knows they're coming long before you do. The first birthday without them. The first anniversary of their death, the holidays, the age they should be by now. Even if you tell yourself you're okay. Even if you don't consciously plan anything. Even if you think this one won't be as hard, something shifts. Your sleep changes, your mood changes. Your body tightens or goes numb, your tolerance drops, and you might wonder why. Especially if you thought you were doing better. But dates are not just dates, they're passageways. Celebrating can feel especially complicated. There's pressure to show up, to participate, to be festive, to be normal. But how do you celebrate when the person who gave the day meaning isn't here? How do you blow out candles when the wish feels impossible? How do you smile through a holiday when everything inside of you is changed? For me, the first year was filled with numbness, brain fog, survival. The next year brought something different, more awareness, more clarity, but sometimes more pain. Because the shock had worn off and the permanence had settled in. Didn't mean I was going backward, it meant I was crossing another threshold, because grief doesn't move in a straight line, it moves through time. And dates are places where the body stops and says, this mattered. You don't owe anyone celebration. You don't owe anyone performance. You don't owe anyone proof that you're okay. You're allowed to mark dates quietly, privately, differently, or not at all. There is no correct way to cross those thresholds, only your way. And that's why Sacred Arc moves slowly here. Because when we honor thresholds inside named grief, we stop judging people for remembering. We stop shaming bodies for reacting, and we stop telling the bereaved who they should be by now. We make room for becoming without demanding arrival. Thresholds become especially visible around the holidays, because holidays don't just mark time, they magnify absence. Everyone else seems to be doing the same things they always do, decorating, planning, gathering, and meanwhile you're thinking, I don't know if I can do this yet, or maybe I don't want to. You might tell yourself, I should be able to handle this, it's been long enough, or other people are moving on, but what holidays often do is make the loss more prominent, not less. They highlight absence, they emphasize what's missing, they remind your body of how things used to feel. So when people ask a simple question, are you excited, or what are you doing for the holidays, you might feel yourself completely freeze. Not because you don't care, but because the version of celebration they're talking about doesn't fit your nervous system yet. My first Christmas after my son died, I was still very numb, deep brain fog, crying every day, though most of the time silently on my own, just trying to get through the hours, but I still showed up. Not because I felt like celebrating, but because I was worried about how my family and my friends would feel if I didn't. Since returning home to California, holidays haven't looked the same. I don't celebrate the same. I don't think I ever will. It's not because I don't care. It's just because everything around me is different and my son isn't there. Sometimes you're in a room with people who love you, your family, and you can feel the atmosphere. You can tell they've talked about what happened. You can tell they have opinions, fears, questions, assumptions. You can feel them scanning you. It's not always mean. Sometimes it's discomfort. Sometimes it's fear of making you sad. Sometimes it's them trying to protect you. But what it creates is this weird situation where your trauma is present in the room and you're the only one who isn't allowed to touch it. So the conversation becomes careful, or stiff, or overly positive, or weirdly superficial. Sometimes people don't even mention your loved one. Maybe they don't know what to say, but often it hurts more when they're not even mentioned at all because it feels like they're being erased. And then that silence becomes its own threshold. And then people say unhelpful things because it's silent. Not because they're cruel, but because they're uncomfortable. They say things like, everything happens for a reason, or you have to move forward. And sometimes what they actually mean is, I don't know how to be with this, so I need you to make it smaller. And that's exhausting. Because then you're not just grieving, you're managing the room. You're carrying your grief and everyone else's discomfort about your grief. And the nervous system feels that. That's why you can leave a family event feeling overstimulated, drained, shaky, or like you need a few days to recover. It's not weakness, it's overload. This is also why being around strangers can sometimes feel easier than being around family. Not because you don't love your family, but because strangers don't expect you to be okay. They don't carry a version of you they want back. They don't watch closely to see if you're doing better. With strangers, you get to choose what you share, or whether you share at all. But even with that, there can be a moment, the question, the pause, the opening where you realize your grief could now enter this space. And in that moment, you're given 3 choices. The first option is to tell the truth, to say it out loud, to name what you've lost. And when you do that, the temperature of the room changes instantly. The air shifts, conversation slows, people don't know where to put their hands or their eyes. Sometimes it brings connection. Sometimes it brings awkwardness, and sometimes it brings a silence that wasn't there before. Second option is to hide it, to simplify, to give a partial answer, to protect the room. And although that can feel easier in the moment, it often comes with a quiet cost, a sense of minimizing something that still matters, a small ache of guilt for not telling the whole truth, a feeling of leaving part of yourself outside of the conversation. And the third option is to deflect, to change the subject, to keep things light, to stay on the surface. And sometimes that's the most protective choice, not because you're avoiding, but because you're conserving energy. But what people don't realize is that none of these options are neutral. Every choice takes effort. Every choice requires self-monitoring. You're constantly reading the room, assessing capacity, yours and theirs, deciding how much of yourself is allowed to exist in that space. That's why social interaction can feel so draining after loss. Not because you don't like people, not because you don't want connection, but because connection now comes with calculation. And when you've lived through something that fundamentally changes you, you don't always want to be the one who shifts the temperature or pretends it never changed. Sometimes the most restful thing is being in a room where nothing is expected of you at all, where you don't have to decide how much truth is allowed. That doesn't mean you're isolating, it means you're listening to your capacity, and that too is information. Going back to work is one of the most misunderstood thresholds because it looks like progress, but often it's just necessity. Some of us don't get to wait until we're ready. We have bills, responsibilities, students, clients, but there's this weird thing that happens when you go back to work after loss. You walk back into a place that still runs on normal time, deadlines, small talk, tasks, meetings, people joking about traffic or coffee or whatever happened on TV, and you're standing there thinking, my whole world changed and this room looks the same. And depending on your situation, you might not even get a soft landing. Some people have bereavement leave and it's like 3 days, 5 days, maybe a week. And then it's like, okay, are you back now? But grief doesn't work on payroll timelines. And this is where the nervous system piece becomes so real because you're not just grieving emotionally, you're performing regulation. You're monitoring your face, your tone, your reactions. You're trying not to cry in a hallway. Or you're trying not to disassociate mid-conversation, or you're trying to remember what someone just said because your brain is foggy and you feel like you're moving through glue. And what makes it harder is that most people read showing up as healing. Like if you're back at work, you must be better. But sometimes you're back at work and you're barely in your body. You're on autopilot. You're doing muscle memory. You're getting through the day and then collapsing in your car or in bed or the shower. And then there's the social part of work. Because work is one of the places where people either avoid it entirely or they bring it up in the clumsiest way imaginable. You get the forced brightness, glad to have you back. How are you? But they don't really want the real answer. Or the quick awkward whisper, I heard, I'm so sorry. And then they disappear. And you're left managing the room again, trying to protect other people from discomfort, trying to protect yourself from being cracked open at 10:14 a.m. on a random Tuesday. Your loss involves someone people know about, like a child. It can become even more complicated because people don't know what to do with that. They don't know what to say, so they either tiptoe or they avoid your name, your story, your reality. What nobody tells you is that going back to work can make grief louder, not quieter. Because work requires output, requires stimulation, it requires being on. And grief already narrows your capacity. So you might notice you get overstimulated faster, your tolerance is lower, your skin flares more easily. You have more fatigue or your patience is thinner, especially with trivial stuff. That doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're carrying two realities at once. One of those is the reality that you have to keep going. There's another threshold people don't talk about enough. The moment you try to return, you say yes, you show up, you go back to work, to gatherings, to routine, and your body reacts anyway. I've had moments where I went, but internally something would start to happen. The conversation would shift. People would start talking about their own losses, hospice stories, family deaths, end-of-life experiences. And I want to be really clear about this. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were sharing. They were relating. They were trying to connect. But my body wasn't ready for that yet. Not because I didn't care, not because I was cold, but because my nervous system didn't have the capacity to hold their grief on top of my own. So instead of crying in the bathroom and coming back with a smile, I left. I didn't leave because I didn't care. I left because my system was done. It wasn't avoidance, it was information. Because things that used to energize you can suddenly feel overwhelming. Not because you're fragile, but because your system is doing more work behind the scenes. There's a constant layer of self-monitoring that happens after loss. You're tracking, am I okay? Do I look okay? Is this too much? Am I about to cry? Can I handle this conversation? Should I say something? Should I stay quiet? That monitoring is exhausting, and people don't see that part. They just see that you left early, that you're quieter, that you don't stay as long, that you decline invitations more often. but what they don't see is how much energy it takes just to be there at all. That was confusing at first because I thought, isn't this supposed to help? Isn't connection supposed to be healing? And it is, but only when it doesn't require self-abandonment. Healing doesn't mean forcing yourself to stay past your capacity. It doesn't mean overriding your body's signals. It doesn't mean proving that you're okay. Sometimes healing looks like listening closely enough to leave before you break. So if you've gone back into the world and felt overwhelmed, if you've left early, you needed recovery time, or realized halfway through that you were done, I want you to hear this. You weren't being rude. You weren't regressing. You weren't failing. You were responding intelligently to what your system could handle in that moment. Grief narrows capacity before it widens it again. And learning where your edges are without shaming yourself for them is part of how capacity slowly returns. You're allowed to leave. You're allowed to need rest, and you're allowed to choose quiet over performance. That doesn't mean you're closing yourself off. It means you're learning how to stay present with yourself. Another reaction that shows up in this space when you do decide to return is one that people feel a lot of shame about. You might notice you get irritated when people complain about things that feel small. Not because you think they're bad people, not because you've lost empathy, but because something inside of you quietly thinks, my whole world changed and this is what we're talking about. Someone is upset about traffic or a minor inconvenience or something that before might have annoyed you too. And suddenly you feel this flash of irritation or distance or even disbelief. And then comes the guilt. Start judging yourself for even having that thought. But this isn't a lack of empathy, it's a change in scale. Because when you've lived through something that fundamentally rearranges your life, especially loss that changes your identity, your nervous system recalibrates what feels significant. Your body has learned this is what actually matters. This is what can be survived, and this is what truly threatens safety. So when someone complains about something that exists on a much smaller scale, your system doesn't know where to put it. It's not cruelty, it's mismatch. You're not thinking they shouldn't feel this way. You're feeling, I don't live in that world anymore. And that can feel incredibly isolating because it creates distance even in familiar relationships. You might go quiet, you might pull back. You might prefer strangers, not because you don't love the people in your life, but because strangers don't expect you to match their emotional rhythm. With family and friends, the pressure feels heavier sometimes. They remember the version of you who could absorb things, who could soothe, who could listen without it costing anything. But that version of you lived before something shifted. And here's what matters to say out loud. This doesn't mean that you've become hardened. It means your system has learned depth. Grief doesn't make people less compassionate. It often makes them more discerning about where their energy goes. And learning how to hold space for yourself before holding space for others is not selfish, it's necessary. One of the hardest parts of grief, especially once you're no longer in crisis, is what happens after the support fades. Because in the beginning, there's often a lot of attention. People check in, they send messages, they ask how you're doing, they give you permission to not be okay. And then slowly, that changes. Not because people are cruel, not because they don't care, but because the world moves on. At some point, people assume that if you're quiet, you must be healing. This is a threshold too, the moment when grief moves from something shared to something you're expected to manage alone. You're functioning, you're showing up, you're answering emails, you're going to work, you're doing the things that signal to the outside world, I'm okay, and so the questions stop. No one asks how you're really doing anymore. They stop checking in the way they used to. They stop saying the person's name. They stop asking if you need anything. And there's this strange, quiet grief that comes with that because you haven't stopped grieving. You've just stopped being asked. I think this is one of the loneliest stages, not the early days when everything is raw and obvious, but in the middle space, when you're supposed to be back, even though nothing inside of you feels the same. People assume silence means healing, but people don't stop asking because your grief ended. They stop because they don't know how to stay present without a script. You learn slowly not to bring things up, not because they're resolved, but because you don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. So you edit yourself. You answer, I'm okay, instead of telling the truth. You redirect the conversation. You swallow what's actually there. And that self-editing takes energy. There's grief in not being asked anymore. There's grief in realizing that the world has decided you should be fine by now. There's grief in knowing that the thing that still shapes your inner world doesn't have a place in casual conversation. And what's hard is that this stage can make you doubt yourself. You start wondering, am I behind? Am I doing this wrong? Why does this still feel heavy if everyone else thinks I'm okay? But this isn't failure, it's the natural shift from visible grief to invisible grief. Because visible grief gets witnessed, invisible grief gets carried quietly. And carrying something quietly doesn't mean it weighs less. It just means there is less room for it to be held. This is also where loneliness changes shape. It's not the loneliness of being alone, it's the loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't see the part of you that's still tender. You can be in a room full of people and feel completely unseen. Not because you're hiding, but because the space no longer makes room for what's real for you. And if you're in that place right now, if you've noticed the check-ins stop, the questions disappear, the assumption that you're better, I want you to hear this clearly. You didn't do anything wrong. Your grief did not expire. Your love didn't diminish. And your need for connection didn't disappear just because time passed. This stage asks for a different kind of support, not the energy kind, not the emergency kind, but the steady kind, the kind that doesn't rush, the kind that doesn't require updates, the kind that lets you be quiet without assuming you're fine. And if you haven't found that yet, it doesn't mean it won't exist. It just means this part of the journey often has to be named before it can be met. That's part of why this space exists. So the invisible parts don't have to stay invisible forever. Because when grief is no longer witnessed, that's often when people start rushing themselves. Not because they're ready, but because carrying it alone feels too heavy. We rush thresholds, not just because of the outside pressure, but because discomfort feels like failure. Stillness feels unproductive. Uncertainty feels weak, and not knowing feels like you're doing something wrong, so we push. We move on too fast, we override ourselves, we tell ourselves we should be further along. But rushed thresholds don't disappear, they come back later, as burnout, as illness, as grief that feels sudden but isn't. When you're in a threshold, there's often this quiet anxiety underneath everything that says, if I don't figure this out soon, I'll get stuck here. Or if I slow down, I might fall apart. So we push and we re-enter. We say yes before we're ready. We try to prove to ourselves as much as to others that we're okay. But rushing isn't actually about strength. It's about discomfort, tolerance. Being in between is hard. Not having answers is hard. Living without a clear identity or direction is hard. And when we don't have permission to stay there, we turn that discomfort into self-judgment. We start thinking, why am I still like this? Why can't I just move on? But those questions aren't evidence of failure. They're signs that you're standing in something that matters. The body notices when we rush, not as punishment, but because it hasn't finished orienting yet. Slowing down in a threshold isn't indulgent, it's protective. And needing time here doesn't mean you're doing life wrong. It means your system is asking for space before it knows what comes next. If you're standing in a threshold right now, hear this. You are not meant to rush through becoming. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are crossing something that deserves care. Before we close today's episode, take one slow breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Notice where you are. Take what resonates from today and leave the rest here. This has been Sacred Arc, honoring the full arc of being human. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.